In all the 4 years since the adoption, nobody had ever knocked on the door without letting them know ahead of time. The sudden knock echoed through the small house, unsettling its quiet rhythm. The young girl, seated by the window, froze, her heart racing. Nightmares of her guardian's horrible aunt sometimes still haunted her, and for a moment she feared it might be her coming back to disrupt their peace. Her guardian, a kind and gentle woman, paused for a moment, visibly concerned. Without hesitation, she made her way to the door, trying to hide her unease. When she opened it, there stood a tall, sharp-looking woman. Her hair was pulled tightly into a neat bun, and her eyes held a certain authority that made her stand out. Without asking for permission, the woman stepped inside, her gaze briefly flicking over the guardian before settling on the rest of the room. "It is very important that I speak to you today," the woman said briskly. "A choice of a lifetime is to be decided. It is not a small matter. May I?" She said it all in one swift breath, and without waiting for an answer, she walked straight into the living room as though she already knew the way. The guardian blinked, momentarily taken aback before managing to utter, "Sorry, but we don't usually open the door to people who don't let us know before they plan to come." And the woman, now standing in the middle of the living room, turned slightly and nodded. "I understand," she replied calmly. The guardian, still confused, glanced back at the door and noticed it had been shut. She hadn't done that, had she? But her mind quickly moved past the thought as she followed the woman further into the room. "Would you like a cup of tea?" the guardian asked, feeling the need to regain some sense of control over the situation. Without waiting for a reply, she hurried into the kitchen, setting the kettle on the stove, her hands trembling slightly from the unexpected encounter. Just as she was about to fetch the cups, she turned, and to her surprise the woman had followed her into the kitchen. "I haven't got too long," the woman said in a no-nonsense tone, pulling out what looked like a polished wooden stick and waved it casually. Then, without another word, she returned to the living room, leaving the guardian standing there, her mouth slightly open in confusion. The guardian glanced at the kettle, which she had not yet filled with water. Frowning, she followed the woman back into the living room and gasped. On the small table in front of the sofa were 3 perfectly brewed cups of tea, steam curling up into the air. She blinked rapidly. "How?" The woman did not wait for further questions. She sat down on the armchair opposite, her posture as straight as an arrow, eyes now focused intently on the guardian. "I believe you are the guardian of a rather remarkable young girl," the woman said calmly, her tone sharp but not unkind. The guardian nodded slowly, still too stunned to speak. "What I have to say may come as a surprise to you, though perhaps it will also provide some clarity," the woman continued, her hands resting neatly on her lap. "The girl you care for, the one who has exhibited unusual abilities, has been on our admittance list for quite some time." The guardian frowned, feeling a chill run down her spine. Was this some kind of gang? She had always known Matilda was special, her brilliance, her strange abilities, the things that could not be explained, but now, to hear it acknowledged by a stranger, made her heart race with fear. "I represent a school," the woman said. "A very special school, where children like her, children with magical talents, are trained to control and hone their gifts." "Magical?" The guardian's voice was barely a whisper. She had seen things, of course, seen Matilda perform feats that defied reason. But magic? That seemed impossible. The woman inclined her head. "Indeed. Her name has been down in the Book of Admittance since she was very young. The quill of acceptance wrote her name with such excitement that it practically danced, and now the time has come for her to take her place." The guardian stared, trying to process what she was hearing. "Her name? You mean Matilda?" The woman gave a slight smile. "Yes, Matilda. Now, forgive me, is it Honey or Wormwood?" The guardian blinked in surprise. "Honey, I suppose. She's under my care now, after all." The woman nodded once as if confirming something important. "Very well," Matilda Honey. She has a place at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. I am Professor McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress of the school. I am here to extend the offer for her to join us." Matilda, who had been sitting quietly, listening intently to the conversation, suddenly looked up, her wide eyes searching McGonagall's face. "A school?" Matilda asked, her voice quiet but steady. "Where I can learn how to control that stuff? All the making objects move when I was angry?" McGonagall's face softened slightly, her stern expression giving way to something almost like warmth. "Precisely. You will learn to control your magic, to understand it. At Hogwarts, you'll be among others like yourself." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the words sinking in. The Guardian glanced at Matilda, a mixture of pride and concern in her eyes. Matilda, for her part, seemed both curious and cautious, but there was also a glimmer of hope. Hope that she might finally find a place where her strange abilities would be expanded. After a pause, McGonagall stood, smoothing her coat as she prepared to leave. "I shall leave you to discuss it further, but time is of the essence. Term begins soon. If you choose to accept, arrangements will be made." The Guardian, still reeling from the encounter, managed to nod. "Thank you, Professor." With a curt nod, McGonagall turned, making her way to the door. And just as she had entered, swiftly and without fuss, she left, leaving behind a silence that seemed almost surreal. The Guardian and Matilda sat in the stillness for a moment, both trying to process the extraordinary events that had just unfolded. After some days of careful consideration, Matilda had made her decision. The idea of going to a school where she could learn to control her abilities, to be among others like her, was too enticing to ignore. Miss Honey, though hesitant at first, supported Matilda's decision wholeheartedly. The day had come for them to meet Professor McGonagall again, this time for something even more extraordinary, a journey to buy Matilda's school things. Only these would magical, and Matilda could only imagine what it might be like while they waited for Professor McGonagall. The morning of the visit was bright but cool. Miss Honey and Matilda were sitting in the living room, waiting in nervous anticipation. It wasn't long before the sharp, familiar knock sounded at the door. Miss Honey opened the door to find Professor McGonagall standing there, looking just as composed and immaculate as ever. She gave them both a small nod and said, "Are you ready?" Miss Honey glanced at Matilda, who nodded eagerly. "We're ready," Miss Honey said. "Very well. We'll be going to purchase everything Matilda will need for her first year at Hogwarts," McGonagall explained. "It may be overwhelming at first, but I'll guide you through it." Miss Honey, who still struggled to grasp the world they were entering, asked, "How do we get there? Is it far?" McGonagall smiled slightly, an expression of someone about to reveal something grand. "Not far at all. We'll be travelling by flue powder, a magical means of transport. It's perfectly safe." They followed her to the fireplace in the sitting room. McGonagall handed a small pouch to Miss Honey. "Take a pinch of this, flue powder, and throw it into the fire. When the flames turn green, step into the fire and clearly say, 'The leaky cauldron.'" Miss Honey's eyes widened. "Step into the fire." McGonagall nodded. "It's safe, I assure you." Matilda, with her usual curiosity, was already leaning forward, eager to experience the unknown. She took the powder from Miss Honey's hand, who still looked uneasy. With a quick motion, Matilda tossed the powder into the flames. Instantly the fire roared up and turned a brilliant green. McGonagall gestured to the fire. "Go ahead, Matilda." Matilda stepped into the flames, unafraid. As soon as she said, "The leaky cauldron," her body spun rapidly, and the living room disappeared around her in a whirl of colour. After a few disorienting moments, she stumbled out of another fireplace into a dimly lit pub. Miss Honey and McGonagall soon followed, appearing from the same fireplace one after another. Miss Honey looked around in awe. "Is this where all magical people come?" she asked, taking in the old cosy surroundings of the pub. People dressed in strange clothes were milling about, some chatting, others disappearing into side doors. McGonagall nodded. "This is the Leaky Cauldron. It's a gateway between the magical world and the non-magical one, but we won't be staying here. Follow me." She led them to a small, seemingly nondescript brick wall at the back of the pub's courtyard. McGonagall tapped the bricks in a precise sequence with her wand, and, to the astonishment of Miss Honey and Matilda, the wall began to shift and fold, revealing a bustling street on the other side. Matilda gasped, her eyes wide with amazement. "Is this where I get my school things?" "Yes," Professor McGonagall replied. "Welcome to Diagon Alley." The street was alive with movement. Witches and wizards in robes hurried past shops that sold everything from cauldrons to enchanted pets. The sight was overwhelming, yet exhilarating. Miss Honey was speechless for a moment, her eyes darting from one shop to the next, unable to comprehend all the magic around her. This is incredible." McGonagall smiled softly. "There's much to see, but we'll start with the essentials." She began leading them down the cobblestone street. Their first stop was Gringotts, the Wizarding Bank. The huge marble building towered above them as they approached. Inside, the atmosphere was strange. Goblins worked behind desks, counting coins and weighing precious stones. McGonagall guided them to a counter where they exchanged some of Miss Honey's money for wizarding currency: gold galleons, silver sickles, and bronze nuts. "This should be enough for your school supplies," McGonagall said, handing Miss Honey a small pouch of wizard coins. As they left the bank, Miss Honey was still recovering from the sight of goblins. "Do they run all the banks here?" "Just Gringotts," McGonagall replied as they made their way to the next shop. "Now, we need to gather Matilda's school supplies." The first stop was Madame Malkin's robes for all occasions. Inside, a short witch with a kind face greeted them and quickly set to work measuring Matilda for her school robes. Miss Honey watched with fascination as the magical measuring tape moved all on its own, taking every inch and centimetre while Madame Malkin chatted away. Next they stopped at Flourish and Blots, a massive bookstore filled from floor to ceiling with books on every magical subject imaginable. Matilda's eyes lit up as she wandered the aisles, her fingers grazing the spines of books titled The Standard Book of Spells and A History of Magic. She felt like she had stepped into a dream. "Pick whichever books you need for your classes," McGonagall instructed. Matilda eagerly gathered her required reading, along with a few extra books that piqued her interest. They moved from shop to shop, collecting potion ingredients, parchment, quills, and even a brass scale for measuring out ingredients. Miss Honey marvelled at each item they purchased, trying to take it all in, but the most exciting stop of all was Ollivander's, the famous wand shop. Inside, the atmosphere was quieter, more intimate. The shop was small, with towering shelves crammed with narrow boxes. Mr. Ollivander himself appeared from the back, his eyes bright with curiosity as he studied Matilda. "A new student for Hogwarts, I see," he said softly. "Let's find you a wand." He began handing Matilda various wands, each one different in size and wood, but none of them seemed quite right. Then, finally, he passed her a wand made of willow, 11 inches long, with a core of dragon heartstring. The moment Matilda touched it, a warm breeze swirled around her, and the room filled with a soft glow. Mr. Ollivander smiled. "Curious? Yes, I believe this is the one. A fine match." Matilda grinned, clutching the wand as though it were a part of her. After collecting everything they needed, they returned to the Leaky Cauldron to head back home. Matilda's mind was buzzing with everything she had seen, and Miss Honey seemed just as overwhelmed. As they prepared to leave Diagon Alley, Miss Honey turned to Professor McGonagall. "This world. It's incredible. I can hardly believe it exists." McGonagall nodded. "It can be difficult to understand at first, but you will soon see that Matilda belongs here, and she will flourish." Matilda glanced up at Professor McGonagall, her eyes full of wonder and excitement. "Thank you," she said quietly. McGonagall smiled, just a hint of warmth showing through her usual stern demeanour. "You are quite welcome, Miss Honey. We will see you both at Hogwarts very soon." And with that they made their way back home, knowing life would never be the same again. The day of the Hogwarts journey had finally arrived, and the air was buzzing with excitement and nervous energy. Matilda, carrying her newly acquired school supplies and wand in a carefully packed trunk, stood at King's Cross Station with Miss Honey. The station bustled with muggles rushing to their trains, completely unaware of the magical adventure that awaited just beyond the barrier between platforms 9 and 10. Miss Honey, still looking slightly out of place in this magical world, turned to Professor McGonagall, who was accompanying them one final time before Matilda set off. "You said the platform is hidden?" "Yes," McGonagall replied calmly. "You need to walk directly through the barrier between platforms 9 and 10. Don't hesitate, just walk briskly, and you'll find yourself on platform 9 and 3/4. Miss Honey hesitated, glancing down at Matilda. "Are you sure it's safe?" Matilda, ever the eager learner, took the lead, pushing her trolley forward and heading toward the barrier. With a deep breath, she strode straight at the brick wall. To her amazement, instead of hitting it, she passed right through. On the other side, an entirely different scene awaited her. Platform 9 and 3/4 was full of hustle and bustle. Witches and wizards waved goodbye to their children as the scarlet steam engine of the Hogwarts Express stood proudly on the tracks, ready to take them all to their new school. Trunks, pets and students swarmed the platform. Miss Honey and McGonagall appeared behind her shortly, with Miss Honey still looking a little dazed by the experience. "Well, that was different," she said with a nervous laugh. Matilda, however, was already absorbing the sights and sounds around her. Nearby she overheard two boys, both with black hair, standing together, talking excitedly, laughing and joking. One of the boys, the taller of the two, laughed and said, "I can't wait to get to Hogwarts. I just hope I break the stupid black family tradition." The other boy raised an eyebrow, smirking. "What do you mean?" The first boy scoffed, rolling his eyes. "My entire family's been in Slytherin for generations. All of them. My idiot brother's already there, and he's not even started Hogwarts. Well, I wouldn't be surprised if I'm right. I know for a fact he won't be the one to break the mould." "Sounds rough," the second boy said, trying to suppress a grin. "You don't know the half of it," the first boy continued. "All Slytherins. Can you imagine the look on my mother's horrible face when she hears her eldest was sorted somewhere other than Slytherin? She'll probably wipe me off the black family tree altogether." The second boy laughed, clapping him on the back. "Maybe you'll get lucky and end up in Gryffindor." The first boy grinned wickedly. "I'd love that. It'd drive her mad." Matilda couldn't help but overhear the exchange and found herself intrigued by the idea of family expectations being broken. She wondered if Hogwarts would bring similar surprises for her. As she continued to push her trolley down the platform, her eyes caught sight of another boy standing by himself. He had greasy black hair that fell into his face, and his expression was one of deep concentration, as though he was already lost in thought. His clothes were a little shabby compared to the others, but his eyes were sharp and observant. He didn't seem to be waiting for anyone, just standing alone, watching the families pass by. As Matilda passed by, she overheard the boy muttering something under his breath, something about potions and spells, though it was hard to make out the rest. He looked up briefly, his dark eyes meeting hers for a split second before he turned away. Further down the platform, Matilda came across a family that seemed to be in the middle of an argument. Two sisters stood close to their parents, both of them talking loudly over one another. One sister had striking red hair and green eyes, and she looked frustrated as her dark-haired sibling, eyes flashing with impatience, folded her arms defiantly. "You're just jealous because I'm going to Hogwarts and you're not," the red-haired girl said, her voice a mix of triumph and frustration. The other girl, dark-haired and glaring, snapped back, "I wouldn't want to go to that freak school anyway." The redhead's face flushed with anger, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned to their parents, who looked uncomfortable as they tried to calm the two girls. Matilda felt a small pang of sympathy for the red-haired girl. She seemed to be so excited about Hogwarts, and yet her sister's bitterness was clouding the moment. Miss Honey gave Matilda's shoulder a gentle squeeze, bringing her attention back to the task at hand. "We should find a compartment," she said softly. They made their way onto the train, Matilda dragging her trunk behind her. As they passed through the narrow corridor, she caught more snatches of conversations. One boy was loudly boasting to a group of friends about how his family had been in Slytherin for generations, and he fully expected to be sorted there as well. His words were met with impressed murmurs, though Matilda noted with curiosity that not everyone seemed particularly pleased with the idea. In another compartment, a pair of students were already comparing the wands they had purchased from Ollivanders. "Mine's oak with unicorn hair," one of them said proudly. "What about yours?" "You and dragon heartstring," the other replied with a grin. Finally, after a few moments of searching, Matilda and Miss Honey found an empty compartment near the back of the train. They slid inside, placing Matilda's trunk carefully on the rack overhead. Miss Honey helped her settle in, smoothing out her skirt and giving her a proud but slightly nervous smile. "Are you sure you'll be all right, Matilda?" Miss Honey asked, her voice tinged with worry. Matilda smiled, her excitement overcoming any nerves. "I'll be fine. I'm ready." Miss Honey nodded, though she still looked reluctant to leave. "All right, then. I'm so proud of you, Matilda. You're going to do wonderfully at Hogwarts." Before she could say anything else, the whistle of the Hogwarts Express sounded loudly across the platform, signalling that it was time for the journey to begin. McGonagall reappeared at the door of the compartment, her eyes softening just a little as she looked at Matilda. "Don't worry, Miss Honey," McGonagall said, her voice reassuring. "Matilda will be in good hands. She has a great deal of potential, and Hogwarts will help her unlock it." Miss Honey nodded, though her eyes were a little misty as she hugged Matilda tightly one last time. "Be brave, Matilda." With one final wave, Miss Honey stepped off the train, leaving Matilda standing by the window, watching her guardian as the train began to pull away from the platform. As the Hogwarts Express gathered speed, Matilda sat back in her seat, her heart pounding with excitement. She glanced out the window at the rolling countryside, a small smile playing on her lips. She was about to embark on an adventure unlike any she had ever imagined, and just as the train picked up speed, the door to her compartment slid open, and the red-haired student Matilda had seen arguing with, presumably her sister, walked in, looking grumpy and grumbling about something. Matilda greeted her with a bright smile. The journey to Hogwarts had truly begun.